Right, so we will make a start. This is week 3 of the weekly webinars. We're going to do stretching, foam rolling, and all things recovery, which is quite a big topic actually. So we'll try and get through as much of it as we can in our short time. There's a few people here who won't know me. So a very quick introduction. I'm Danny. I run DC Injury Clinic and Washbourne House Therapy Centre. I'm co-owner, co-director, which is a multidisciplinary clinic in Wroughton. These are all the various ways you can contact me afterwards if anyone wants to, or if anyone's got anything they'd like to ask in private. So recovery, at the end, we'll go through all of your questions. As I say, recovery is a surprisingly complex area, really, primarily because we don't really have a great definition of what recovery is. Everyone has their own sort of criteria of what that means. And even if we go into the literature and the research, there's various criteria that we look at for recovery. So some research looks at DOM, so delayed onset of muscle soreness. They use that as a marker. Sometimes it's fatigue. Sometimes it's inflammation or muscle damage, which are blood markers, individual ones. And sometimes it's as simple as expectation or perception. So it's very hard to actually tie down what recovery means, and it will mean something different to everyone in the room tonight. Firstly, we need to look at the exercise response. So what actually happens when we're running. So this is your classic graph of someone training. So generally when we're running, we come under our base level of fitness, which is how when we're fatiguing. So we come under as we're overloading. Then we go through our recovery protocol, which obviously we're going to talk about. Then the body adapts to the load, so the progressive overload, and then we come back down to base level. This looks fine, but actually this is someone that's probably under training because they're always returning to base level. So again, we're looking for a progressive overload. So we're looking to challenge the system, to make a change, to see improvements, whether that's strength or fitness, whatever your gauge is. So an ideal training regime looks like this, where we're hitting the peak of the curve of adaptation, then training again and making that constant progression. So we call these guys our super compensators. So we all want to be a super compensator. It's frustrating because the most important thing on these graphs for me is the bottom axis, time, and that's the one thing that we have no answer for. There's no gauge for that. It's completely individual. I always say to people, as an example, we know that the Achilles tendon, so the biggest tendon in the body, will take about 36 hours to start regenerating post-run. So if you're someone that likes to run every day, and that's fine, we just have to acknowledge that the Achilles tendon, particularly the collagen fibers, won't have even started regenerating post-run. So that's something that's always worth bearing in mind. But we need to find that sweet spot in our training blocks and our training sessions. So this is week to week, and as a training block, we need to find that sweet spot at the top of the curve where we've adapted, we've overloaded, recovered, adapted, and then we can progress. This is our protocol that we're going to look at tonight, and again, it will vary for everyone. Everyone will have their different favoured approach. There's a few things on here that are non-negotiable for me, but we'll get to them as we go through them. For me, recovery is I would break it down into 3 parts. You've got your nutritional side of recovery, your physiological or neurological part of recovery, and then your psychological part of recovery as well. And they're all as important as each other, so they all kind of overlap, which again we'll go into. So first things first, recovery starts as soon as you finish your run. So if you're a club runner, it doesn't start as soon as you finish your run and then had a 15-minute chat with your buddies. And it doesn't start as soon as you finish your run, led on the sofa for 15 minutes. It starts as soon as you finish. If you want to be in optimal shape to run again, whether it's tomorrow or 48 hours later, 72 hours later, recovery has to start as soon as you finish your run. Primarily hydration. We're going to hydrate as soon as we finish. So simple things like water. There's lots of fancy ways to measure how much fluid you lose during your runs. You can download various apps, and there's various algorithms of, if you simple one, weighing yourself before you run, weighing yourself after you run. Then they're not exactly specific. I'm I'm much more simple. I would use a P chart and monitor your wee. It's a bit less glamorous. On my website, I've got a blog on recovery, and there's a P chart on there that you're quite welcome to print off. I know it's like all your dreams come true, but just monitor your wee back to that straw type colouring. Tart cherry juice is interesting. I'm sure not many people use it, but we can discuss that at the end. So tart cherry juice is really high in anti-inflammatory polyphenol compounds, so really nice for anti-inflammatory response. It's really expensive, so it's not exactly a necessity. You'll get it in places like Holland and Barrett. It's really expensive, tart cherry juice, but like I say, really good for anti-inflammatory compounds. Chocolate milk is a big favourite for a lot of people now. High in sugars, high in protein, high in sodium, and overall probably cheaper than protein skakes. Just about. Protein shakes are very in, but they do come at a cost. A cheaper alternative to those is a semi-skimmed milk powder from one of the supermarkets. There'll be a couple of quid, and they'll offer you probably 80% of what the £40 tub of protein will offer you. So they're not a bad option. The most important thing so far is active recovery, which is essentially what we would have called warm down a number of years ago. For me, it's the most important part. There's three most important parts of recovery. It's one of the three most important parts of recovery. So it always looks a bit more intimidating on screen than it needs to be. I'm not for a minute saying that you have to finish your run and jump in a swimming pool, get on your road bike and go through the mountains. But 5 to 10 minutes of walking, 5 to 10 minutes on a static bike, if you've got one at home, if you're lucky enough to have one, is all it takes really. If you're someone that has a gym membership, running from the gym and then getting in the pool for 10, 15 minutes works really well. In lieu of all that, because most of us don't have those things, walking for the last 10 minutes of your planned time out of the house works really well, or stretching. Stretching's really interesting. I've had a couple of questions sent in prior to tonight around stretching, and it's a huge subject really. We don't know as much about stretching as you would think we know. We know that dynamic stretching has far greater benefit than static stretching. Most of that research is done when looking at performance rather than recovery, but dynamic stretching, and I'll explain that in case anyone doesn't know what I'm talking about. So static stretching is stood still and stretching. Dynamic stretching is more movement based. So the difference between a hip flexor lunge stretch and doing dynamic lunges, the dynamic lunge is obviously a dynamic stretch. In fact, we've got a couple of examples of those. So if we would say, instead of stretching your hamstrings, a runner's touch or single leg deadlift with no weights, instead of doing a calf stretch, doing calf pumps, instead of doing glute stretches, doing leg swings across the body, all of those would seem to have far greater benefit than static stretching. The other thing we need to consider with static stretching is we know that it will have a negative effect on performance for up to 24 hours. So if you are someone, again, that wants to run every day or is running every day, in theory at least, the literature would suggest that if you're stretching every day after your run, you're going to be in that negative or in that deficit when you start your next run. So dynamic stretching would definitely be more beneficial than static stretching. There is a place for static stretching. There's a nice piece of research in evidence-based sports medicine from a few years ago that found that static stretching was useful for injury reduction. We'll look at some more stats as we go on, but essentially, if I was to finish my run and I wasn't running the next day, the areas I would be hitting, I would be stretching my calves, my quads primarily. Hamstrings not so much, glutes not so much. And again, as we get to the end, if anyone's got any specific questions on them, then do fire them up. So eating, nutrition, fueling post-run is something that is always fun. There's lots and lots to talk about with fueling. I think we obsess with protein, but all of the literature seems to favour a 4-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein. So we need to be making sure we're getting our carbs as well as our protein. Like I say, a lot of people, I think, go straight for the protein shake to try and get the muscle regrowth. But it's important to get your carbs in there as well. Ideally, you want to get something on board within 30 minutes of running. So it doesn't need to be huge. 100 to 300 calories post-run seems optimal, but within 2 or 3 hours, we want to be getting a good meal in. And like I say, with that 4-to-1 ratio, carbs to protein. I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not going to dwell on this too long. I work with a really great nutritionist. She's on Facebook, Faye, FMH Fitness. If anyone wants a bespoke nutrition plan, then Faye's your go-to person, really. So back to our recovery protocol, compression garments. So lots of people will run in compression garments, so calf guards, or there's zero benefit to performance for compression garments. Anecdotally, people really like them, but the benefit, we can't find any benefit to performance. But in recovery, really beneficial. Ideally, we want graded compression. So that means they would be tighter at the ankle than they would at the hip. So that encourages venous return. So it's pushing the blood back up the legs essentially. But they work really well. The research into compression garments for recovery is really strong. Like I say, performance, unfortunately not, but that doesn't mean that people don't love them. So that's absolutely fine if you wear them and you like them. Some top level runners always wear them. So anecdotally, they seem to work, but from a research perspective, not so much. And then everyone's favorite part, sleep. So we know that a decrease in sleep decreases protein synthesis, so a decrease in muscle recovery, decreases the glycogen resynthesis, which are energy stores, decreases memory and learning from your central nervous system, and it increases your susceptibility to illness, which we touched upon on the first week we did this. There's a correlation with too much exercise lowers your immune system, so something we need to be aware of. You've got a sleep checklist there. I can send this infographic out to anyone that wants to have a look at it. It's fairly straightforward. It recommends napping, which is an absolute result, but I've got a 6- and an 8-year-old in the house and that's never going to happen. And there's also an element of stress increases inflammatory response. So particularly at the minute, lots of people are stressed, as you would naturally accept. So we have to acknowledge that recovery is a little bit slower at the minute for a lot of people because the cortisol levels are higher, which again has a positive or negative relationship with anti-inflammatories or inflammation. So something's been missing so far, which is the reason you're all here, I'm sure. And I think at this point, I think 50% of you are going to try and lynch me and 50% of you are going to send me thank you cards. So see which camp you're in, okay? Like I say, it's really hard to measure recovery because of all those, because of all the criteria. Like we said, we've got DOMS, fatigue, inflammation, muscle damage, expectation. Expectation is really important. So I think there's a misconception. Anyone who knows me thinks I'm really anti foam rolling, and I'm not at all. What I do is I read a lot, and I don't hide away from that fact. So we've got a meta-analysis here of the effects of foam rolling, performance and recovery. The meta-analysis, for those unfamiliar with it, is the gold standard for research. So meta-analysis comes in at the top of evidence-based medicine pyramid. So I remove all emotion from this, I remove all opinion from this. All we do is we look at the research, we research the research, and then I tell you guys as runners what the research says. And if the research says that, then I don't feel like I, as a therapist, am earning my money telling you guys to do this. If I were to change foam rolling at the top there and in this title and put plate spin in there, you would laugh at me. That's fact, I think, isn't it? But because we've got foam rolling and it's an accepted truth, I know that 50% of the people here will be saying, no, it works for me. There's a really brilliant book, really influential to me, by Carl Sagan called Demon Haunted World. And it's nothing to do with my industry. It's just a pure nerdy science book, and it's brilliant. But in the undertone of that book is that science doesn't care. It doesn't care for me. It doesn't care for you. It just tells you the results. And these are the results of what foam rolling does. So I don't feel like I can tell you guys that foam rolling will help your recovery. And again, I appreciate that for some people, they won't go to bed until they foam rolled. I'm going to get lynched. That's cool. That's fine. I would say everyone in the room now will be able to find some research that says foam rolling does work, and that's cool as well. But again, that research would have gone into the meta-analysis to see what that overwhelming result was. So there was a meta-analysis on recovery done in 2018, and that measured on perception. So that the outcome there was perceived recovery, which is a little bit subjective. But that meta-analysis on perceived recovery found that so that measured blood markers as well as DOMS and fatigue, but overall perceived recovery, and it found that active recovery and massage were the best for DOMS and fatigue, and that compression garments and massage were the best for inflammation. And I think a fair question to add on to that is, what's the difference between massage and foam rolling? Because a lot of you will have been told, I'm sure, that foam rolling is a substitute for massage, which is a fair assumption, I think, and it doesn't really touch upon that in the literature. The difference is, when you are having a massage, in theory, a therapist will be working at approximately 45-degree angle into your tissue, and when you're lying on a cylinder, all you're doing essentially is compressing the muscle against the bone. That doesn't mean there's not a perceived benefit of foam rolling, of course. And again, even the results say, if we're being sort of pedantic, and I think we should, it says the results are rather minor and partly negligible. It doesn't say non-existent. It just says they're minor and partly negligible. But you will feel better for foam rolling because of those endorphins and the serotonin that your brain's releasing. So you will feel better. We just know that physiologically the benefit perhaps isn't there. So again, by all means, if that's contrary to what you guys are doing or you've been told to do, by all means, drop me a message and we can go over it. But like I say, I try and take emotion out of it. I can't be offended if you disagree with this, because I didn't do this research. I'm not smart enough to do this research. So injury reduction, like I say, we spoke earlier. So stretching seems to have a positive relationship with injury reduction, but this research paper found it's incredibly low compared to other interventions. And I know we're talking about recovery, but it does all tie in. And we'll go through how I think that ties in a second. Where are we? So other things, other considerations, other things that people use as part of their recovery protocol. Ice baths. That works on a premise of something called vasoconstriction. So it kind of decreases the ability for blood flow, and then you get out of the bath, your legs warm up, it increases blood flow, and it washes out all these things that no one can ever determine what they are, but that fresh blood flow comes in and is good for recovery. It doesn't seem to have the positive, ice baths don't seem to have the positive effect that we thought they did. And there's no difference between ice bath and cold water immersion. And there's no difference between ice bath, cold water immersion, and hot to cold bath, so contrast bathing. So any of them have an effect, albeit quite a low level. Magnesium is quite popular now. Lots of people will take magnesium either orally or as a transdermal spray. So the research is very sparse in this. Generally, you'll find the more positive research is on websites where they're selling transdermal sprays, unfortunately. Much like, again, if I was being cynical, I'd say much of the positive foam rolling review comes from people selling foam rollers, which is fair enough. But the research seems to suggest that magnesium orally has a better effect, but we don't know if that's true. And ultimately, magnesium you can get through your diet, albeit it's a bit tricky. So lots of leafy greens, fatty fish, and dark chocolate is very good for magnesium as well. So those, again, I'm not going to go deep into the nutrition, but those are the things that you could look to increase in your diet rather than taking a supplement maybe. Recovery runs, which I think we'll all agree is a bit of an oxymoron. Recovery runs aren't, I would be happier if they were just called runs. You can't do a recovery run. It's running will damage and cause inflammation. They're always on everyone's training program, but as I say, if you're running, you're not going to be recovering. People will often say, but I think I'm flushing out all these toxins, or I'm flushing out lactic acid from my legs. And there's a couple of things with there because no one can ever tell you what these toxins are. They don't seem to exist. They're just a word that runners like to use. And lactic acid is not a thing. We never, ever, as runners, have lactic acid in our legs. It's an impossibility. If we're being pedantic, we have lactate, which is completely different, but we never have acid in our legs. So the thought of moving them on, it makes no sense, unfortunately. So recovery runs, like I say, I've got no issue with someone running the day after their long run to feel better. That's kind of an extreme active recovery. It's not a recovery run. And I am pedantic, so apologies. Ultimately, again, looking at this paper we've got now, the best thing for injury reduction is getting stronger. And again, I think intuitively, we all know that, because everyone in this room now, as a runner, will have had a running route that at some point would have been horrific, would have written them off, they'd have done that run, and 3 days later, they're still feeling it. But now that's not the case, because they've got stronger and they've mastered that running route. And it hasn't been because their recovery routine's improved, it's because they've become stronger. There's a brutal truth with DOMs, that if you want less DOMs, you need to work harder, because then your body is going to adapt to that session and you're not going to feel the DOMs as much. Everyone's going to hate me now. So let's go. Let me unmute you all, if I can work out how to do that.